The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it, to find out what, may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce. That was a straightforward request. The journey, however, would be anything but straightforward. Lewis had no idea what he would find when he stepped into the wilderness. He needed help to lead this trip, so he called on his good friend William Clark, a 33-year-old military officer. Both had been in the Army and had a lot of experience living out in the wild. They could hunt and fish, make shelters, and defend themselves against enemies. After finding about 40 soldiers, hunters, and boatmen to join their adventure, including Clark's slave York, the Corps set off for St. Louis, where they spent the winter of 1803. Lewis insisted on bringing along his dog, Seaman, a Newfoundland who could swim better than the men, most of whom couldn't swim at all. There they waited out the harsh winter weather. Then in May 1804, after the ice had thawed, they set off on the Missouri River, not sure who or what they would find. Chapter 3. The newest and littlest member of the Corps. When the Corps of Discovery arrived at the Hidatsa and Mandan villages in the fall of 1804, it was big news. Unlike Sacagawea's band of the Lemhi, who had never seen white people before, these tribes were used to foreigners coming through the area to trade. Still, word spread quickly from hut to hut about the men in the boats. They didn't have a lot of entertainment, and this definitely counted as such. The weather had already turned, so Lewis and Clark set up camp for the winter across the river from the villages. They couldn't travel during the coldest months. The temperature could drop to 50 degrees below freezing, and it was as good a place as any to wait for spring. The Indians they met seemed friendly, but Lewis and Clark wanted them to stay that way. So they invited the Indian chiefs over many times to give them gifts, such as shiny medals bearing the image of Thomas Jefferson. They also explained that the Corps came in peace. The Indians approved and returned with gifts of corn and other crops they had grown, as well as buffalo meat. Everyone was happy with the exchange. With winter approaching, the Corps got busy building a shelter. Fort Mandan consisted of 8 cabins made from cottonwood trees, the cracks stuffed with rags and grass for insulation. They also built a high stockade with a gate and a lock, just in case the Indians decided to stop being friendly. Charbonneau, like any smart trader, was always trying to figure out if he possessed anything with which he could make a profit. Opportunities like the Corps of Discovery didn't pass through the villages every day. Everyone knew the travelers were headed to the sea, and to reach the sea they would have to pass over the Rockies. They would never make it through the mountains without horses. However, they couldn't get horses from the Hidatsa and Mandan villages because they still needed to travel a good distance by water before arriving at the mountain range. That meant the Corps would have to trade for horses with the Shoshone when they got to the Rockies. A light went off in Charbonneau's head. He was in the ideal position for a trader because he had something the Corps needed desperately: Sacagawea. As a member of the Shoshone tribe, she would easily be able to negotiate for horses. Plus, she spoke both Shoshone and Hidatsa fluently, so she could act as a translator. Charbonneau headed over to Fort Mandan to make a deal. The fur trader was right. Lewis and Clark wanted Sacagawea to join the expedition. She would translate Shoshone into Hidatsa for Charbonneau, who would translate it into French for Corps member Francois Labiche, who would then translate it into English. One conversation could take forever, but at least the captains would be able to understand the Indians. They offered Charbonneau $25 a month, 3 to 5 times what the other members of the Corps were making. Lewis and Clark were very glad to have Sacagawea on board, although they weren't quite as excited about Charbonneau. Lewis wrote, "He was useful as an interpreter only." A week after the men sealed the deal with a handshake, Sacagawea arrived at Fort Mandan with Charbonneau. They planned to live with the rest of the Corps until it was time to continue the expedition. Lewis and Clark met the teenage Indian, who presented them with a beautiful hand-sewn buffalo robe. After she gave them the heavy garment, they learned something they hadn't known about Sacagawea before. She was 7 months pregnant. The Journals of the Corps of Discovery. Lewis and Clark were expected to keep detailed journals as part of the mission for the president. They documented their travels through writing and drawings. Almost everything scholars know about the expedition comes from their journals. What Lewis, Clark, and other men on the expedition wrote totals nearly 5,000 pages. Although Lewis and Clark mentioned Sacagawea some 36 times, none of the entries mention her actual words, and very few talk about how she felt. To see the text of the actual journals, yes, all 5,000 pages, check out lewisandclarkjournals.unl.edu. Lewis and Clark would share many adventures with Sacagawea, but the first one was when she gave birth. She went into labor on February 11, 1805, in Fort Mandan, which was filled with men who didn't have a clue how to deliver a baby. Neither did Sacagawea, since this was her first child. Lewis, who tended to her, wrote in his journal that her labor was tedious and the pain violent. While Sacagawea struggled with contractions, someone at the fort told Lewis to give her the rattle of a rattlesnake to eat. In an extraordinary stroke of luck, Lewis had some rattles in the samples of plant and animal life he had been collecting to bring back to the president. 10 minutes after eating the rattle, Sacagawea gave birth to a baby boy named Jean-Baptiste. He became the littlest member of the Corps. Chapter 4. The Journey Begins. On Sunday, April 7, 1805, the Corps of Discovery was finally ready to set off on their journey. Sacagawea wrapped up her baby, whom the men called Little Baptiste, and strapped him to her back in a cradle board, which is a piece of wood with leather laces. Baptiste was snug and secure as Sacagawea said goodbye to Otter Woman, Charbonneau's other wife, and other friends she had made in the last 5 years. Then she got into one of the boats filled with a total of 32 people, equipment for the expedition, and Seaman, the dog. The Hidatsa and Mandan villages slowly receded into the distance as the boats headed up the Missouri River. Lewis was filled with both hope and fear as they paddled toward the unknown. He had no idea what was going to happen, but he wasn't nervous at all. "Entertaining as I do the most confident hope of succeeding in a voyage," he wrote, "I could but esteem this moment of my departure as amongst the most happy of my life." The expedition was difficult from the start. Traveling west on the Missouri River, the Corps was going against the current. The paddling was exhausting and sometimes got so tough that the men had to get out and push the boats. Equipment check. 2 pirogues, open boats hollowed from a log with sails and flat bottoms that made them easier for fishing and shallow rivers. Several canoes made from cottonwood trees. Teepee materials, dried buffalo skins to tie around a dozen wooden poles. Guns and ammunition, mapping instruments, medicine, 14 bales of presents for the Indians, including red, white, and blue beads. Blue was the Indians' favorite kind. Journals for writing, yards of oilcloth to wrap the goods and keep out dampness and mold. Even though it was spring, the river was still ice cold. As they pushed, the men's feet and legs would be freezing, as well as banged up from rocks and sunken logs. Sacagawea might not have pushed the boats, but the young woman quickly proved she was as capable and willing to help as anyone else on the expedition. And she was the only one who also had to tend to a newborn. She was especially good at gathering wild foods, something the rest of the Corps didn't know anything about. Digging in the ground, she unearthed wild artichokes, licorice, and a root they called white apple. The men hungrily gobbled up whatever she found, since they needed all the nourishment they could get. Sacagawea wasn't just skilled at finding food. About a month after they left the Indian villages, they were traveling on the river when a sudden gust of wind hit the boat. The wind was so strong, it pushed the boat on its side and water began to rush in. Charbonneau panicked. Like most of the other men in the boat, who were also very frightened, he couldn't swim. Charbonneau, the most timid waterman in the world, as Lewis described him, grabbed the sides of the boat and started screaming and praying. Meanwhile, the boat, which also carried Sacagawea and her baby, was filling with more water and threatening to completely capsize. Lewis and Clark, who had been walking on the shore alongside the boats, fired their guns to get the men's attention, calm them down, and give orders. As Charbonneau wailed, they were terrified that all the medicine and other goods on board were going to wind up floating down the river. A few of the men began paddling to shore, while others bailed water out of the boat to keep it from sinking. The captains breathed a sigh of relief, and then noticed something remarkable. Among the hysteria, there was Sacagawea calmly holding Baptiste in one hand and retrieving goods that had washed overboard with the other. If she was scared, she didn't show it. Because she maintained a level head, the Corps only lost a few items. Lewis and Clark recognized that Sacagawea was a special woman, both courageous and capable. In his journal, Lewis described her as having equal fortitude and resolution with any person on board at the time of the accident. The captains were so impressed that a few days later, they named a branch of the river after Sacagawea. Chapter 5. Danger Ahead. The boat accident was just the start of the trouble. Sacagawea was about to face death, and this time she would have to rely on others to help her. In early June, Sacagawea came down with a terrible fever. Because they didn't have antibiotics yet, when someone had an infection, there was nothing to do but wait it out and hope for the best. Sacagawea was likely suffering from an infection as her fever rose higher and higher. Clark, who saw how much she was suffering, took care of her. He sat with Sacagawea through the night, applying bark poultices, soft materials applied to the body to relieve soreness or inflammation. He hoped they would make her better, but her condition only worsened. The Corps had been waiting for Sacagawea to get better before they moved on, but they couldn't wait any longer. They had to push on if they were going to make it across the Rockies before camping for winter. Every day counted, so Clark laid Sacagawea down in a shaded spot in the pirogue. He administered 2 kinds of painkillers he had on the trip, but she continued to suffer, especially since she was in an uncomfortable boat holding onto her baby who was still breastfeeding. It seemed like a miracle, but a week after she came down with the fever, Sacagawea showed small signs of improving.